Welcome to the 1CA podcast. This is your host, Jack Gaines. Today, Colonel Andreas Eckel, commander of the NATO Civic Center of Excellence, joins us to discuss the center's work to prepare the alliance for future crises and disasters. So let's get started.
What we need to understand a little bit better, and I think that was a very brutal lessons we identified in Afghanistan and in Mali as well, is that military functions in different societies very, very differently. We have an idea how military looks like and how it works. It might work more the Italian style or the German style or the US style, but basically I think we have a common set of ideas how military works. And military works completely different in Mali than in Afghanistan than in Germany. And that is based on different societies.
So how do we figure that out?
It's a very good question. If I had a quick and sharp answer to that one, I think I would be the winner of the $1 million question. There are some ingredients to tackle that problem. And one of the ingredients is to understand the environment a little bit better. And that leads to civil-military cooperation. The one centerpiece of civil-military cooperation is to understand the environment better, to nest military activities in the civil environment in a better way. It creates more converging effects and creates less harm to the civil population. And I think the next thing is you need to have long-lasting relationships. Relationship that is built up, that's great. If it lasts 1 year, that's great. And if you just end it then, basically you have achieved almost nothing. So long-lasting relationships and to understand the civil environment better. And we have to understand that we are not the ivory tower of knowledge. What do we know? What does the military know about Mali and Afghanistan? Basically nothing. We have to be more and better in contact with the civil organizations, with academia, with knowledge centers that are engaged in those areas since 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And we have to be in a dialogue with them and have to extract their knowledge about the key civil factors and have to integrate that better in military considerations.
So you have to be a diplomat in two directions, because you've got to be reaching out to the partner nation like Mali, working with your counterparts there. You have to be a diplomat with partner agencies within the government and academia, as you were saying, or else you're going to miss a step. So you really have to work your way across the spectrum.
Yeah, I like your picture of being a diplomat because exactly as you mentioned, it's a diplomat in both ways, but you have to be a translator as well. So civil environment, civil actors, civil counterparts speak a different language than we. And we really have to make sure that what they say is understood by the military and what the military means properly translated in how the civilians understand it.
You know, and that's a good point, because I've seen civil affairs, CIMIC officers come in and try to brief leadership on certain issues. And if it wasn't absolutely clear and in the language that commander knew, they usually just were dismissed, and it wasn't as effective a operation because of it.
And by the way, at the beginning of my career in the military function of CIMIC, it happened to me too. So one of my first appearance of the stage, briefing the commander about some civil factors, was a complete disaster because I underestimated how many minutes I only have to bring over some key messages to the commander. So I talked too long and did not came to the point. And I think that's the point where the CCOE is really in a responsibility. We have to provide in our courses the overview, the background, and we provide expertise and challenge them with tasks to apply the expertise. But at the very end of every course, we tell them, hey, CIMIC is important, and it is important to understand the environment, and it is important to integrate civil factors in military considerations. However, when you are confronted with decision makers, your product needs to be crisp and sharp. If you provide a product to your commander which exceeds 3 pages, then you can throw it in the dustbin. By the way, 1 page is better than 3 pages. And I think CIMICers have the tendency, and I include myself specifically into that one, to speak too long and to explain too long and not to come to the point. And if at the end of your statement there is no so what and what's next, well, then don't say anything. That's better.
Well, for this podcast, I appreciate you speaking too much. That's a good thing. But I also understand it's a challenge, but once you get used to it, I think it's super, super helpful.
What we both concluded, coming to the point, should not be mixed up with not doing your analysis. Only because you have 2 minutes to brief your commander about a major factor that will impact his operation doesn't mean that your analysis should only be 2 minutes. So you have to provide the analysis for an in-depth briefing if required to integrate that knowledge and your assessment in the staff work of the other branches. So it needs to be both a very in-depth, precise analysis and assessment, and then it is your time on the stage. The light will shine on you for 2 minutes. That's it.
That brings up a story on my side. I sent one of my pitch decks to a former boss, and he took it, he read it, and then he read all of the sources that I had put in the back. And so he knew the subject just as well as I did when we met. And I was like, holy cow. Yes, it's important to do good research before you put together your summary, because you never know how deep somebody's going to dive into an issue. And if you've done bad research and they catch it, you're done. So one of the things that being that diplomat, both to the military and to other government bodies, one thing that I found at the Strategic Foresight Conference, and it was in your report as well, is that CIMIC needs clarification of capabilities in peace and crisis. And what feedback I got from meetings was that not all militaries have a strong relationship with their public. That's a big concern, because if a military doesn't have the trust, when you get to a crisis or a disaster, you got to really overcome a lot in order just to provide aid and support.
Yeah, that's a crucial point. I have 2 takes on that. The first one is we have nations that do allow, on very lowest tactical level, the interaction between military and the civil world. But it is a question of being honest to ourselves. That is not applicable in all countries. Some of our countries in the alliance are very restrictive interaction with the civil environment, with civil authorities, at least on the lower tactical level. And that brings me to my second point. It's a national responsibility. So when we talk about CIMIC as a military function, then we have to look at it from 2 sides. One is NATO. CIMIC is embedded in a NATO command structure, NATO force structure. However, NATO is operating on the soil of sovereign nations. So we promote and stimulate that nations build up, maintain, and integrate a kind of CIMIC capability. We call that domestic CIMIC. We made a proposal for what domestic CIMIC is. However, nations are completely free to fill that skeleton with their structures. They can call it a domestic CIMIC, they can call it territorial forces, they can call it homeland defense forces. It doesn't matter how they fill in that skeleton, as long as they do provide civil factor integration, as long as they execute civil military interaction. And for the alliance as a whole to plan and prepare and conduct successful operations, need to plug in to the national CIMIC domains and the domestic CIMIC domains. And we have to do that via the national military structures. So what we do in deterrence and defense related scenarios is a little bit differing from what we have done in international crisis management in the past. When CIMIC teams from the alliance or whatever security force was implemented in that, we very often did the civil military interaction with civil partners on the ground by ourselves without using any layer in between us. But when we do that now as NATO in Germany and Poland, Lithuania, Romania, and we have to plug in to their military structures and via them with the civil actors on the ground. And nations consider that very differently. So there are nations that say, hey, great that you're in. Please feel free to speak to our civil organizations by yourself. It would be nice if you inform us afterwards. Everything's great. The nations are more restrictive and say, hey guys, a ministry, whenever you talk to an organization, whenever you talk to civil partners, please do that via us and ask us first. So there is a variety of how nations would like to have that executed. And we as CIMICers have to adapt.
Right. What I've seen is that disaster relief and crisis coordination between the military and the civil governments is fairly good, but I'm not seeing emotional side as much. And what I mean is we just had the Marine Corps Marathon and people all across DC and around the country came, they ran their 24 miles. These kind of military events where people go, they see some type of form of patriotism, honor guards at sporting events or marathons or the military band performing on the park plots. Those things make a difference. And I don't know if that was also included in your area of domestic CIMIC. Have you seen anything like that?
In the last years, when we talked about the use of military assets in our nations, it was to overcome disasters. It was to provide military assistance to civil organizations to overcome flooding, fires, or whatever. But the situation has changed a little bit. And now it is not so much about military assistance in case of man-made big disasters. It's more about civil defense. It's more about stimulating the civil support to military operations and the mutual support in case of crisis and war. And I think that notion is quite new to many European countries. In Germany, it was support of the military to the civil authorities in case of disasters. But when you look into Sweden, Norway, and Finland, they have since decades a kind of total defense strategy. They have a DNA about that the whole of the nation needs to be ready to defend the nation. And that starts already when you go into your cellar. Is there water? Is there food? Are there batteries? And when you do that in Finland, Sweden, Norway, the answer is yes, there is food and there is water. And I was quite astonished. A couple of years ago, I had a NATO course in Helsinki. At that time, when Helsinki was still a NATO partner and not a NATO nation. And it was an exported course from NATO School over Ammergau. And during the weekend, we had the opportunity to visit Helsinki. And we came across a protection infrastructure was located to protect the civilians. And the lady asked us, do you have an idea for how many citizens of Helsinki we have shelter? And I said, well, 50%. And she was smiling and she was collecting all the numbers. And then she came up and said, for every citizen in Helsinki, there is shelter. And that's the difference. A regularly trained system of civil defense and military defense working hand in hand, I think that makes a difference. And I see that coming up in Europe. And again, I would like to use the example of Germany. Since the last couple of years, a lot of more effort has been put into the training and the exchange of information and the exercising of those structures. And I think we are getting there. The point is, when you have dismantled those structures, those strategies since 1990, because our enemy was disappearing, never disappeared, he was just dormant and has been woken up a couple of years ago. But to reinstall that, reactivate that, revitalize that takes years and years. So we are at the beginning. I'm a very optimistic person. I strongly hope that we are getting to a point quick enough that when the Russian bear is looking again to Europe, when he has solved his problem in Ukraine, that we are ready at that point. And there are substantial measurements that we need to be ready latest in 4 to 5 years. And CIMIC plays a role in that because your armed forces can be as good as possible when the civil environment is vulnerable and stays vulnerable and is not able to absorb shocks and to compensate the shocks at a better level after the shock, then you will lose the conflict. That's crystal clear. Even in that time in 2023, where it seemed, at least for some time, that the Ukrainians have regained the initiative, the Russians did attack the civil infrastructure, the energy infrastructure, the transport infrastructure, the health infrastructure. And they were still winning at that battlefield, although they had massive casualties on the fighting battlefield. And I think where Ukraine will run into massive problems this year is that the Russians may not have the big tactical victory. They may not have the breakthrough through the Ukrainian defense lines. But what they will do is they will seriously damage the Ukrainian energy infrastructure, health infrastructure, transport infrastructure. Third year in a row. And I'm not sure if the Ukrainians will be really able to compensate that this time.
It's a real challenge. The thing that I see with Ukraine is that there's also a recruiting issue. They're struggling to keep up with manpower. And there's some international volunteers coming in, but probably not enough compared to what the Russians are bringing in. So it's a challenge of numbers in a lot of ways. But they do build that trust and that familiarity with the military. So having the military band come out and play on the Königstrasse makes a difference. Or like they did in Poland, having American and Polish troops go with a vehicle and park in the middle of a Platz and take photos with kids, it makes a difference.
You're right. Your argument is good. And it connects pretty well with the decisions we have to make in Europe right now. And that decision is that we have to nest the military better into the societies. But what needs to be installed, reactivated, and built up is a whole of society approach for resilience and civil defense.
Okay. The biggest challenge right now is sabotage, which has been happening in and around Europe. The Chinese ship that cut the communication lines, the water poisoning in Germany. So there seems to be already challenges in security.
Yeah, CIMIC plays, first of all, a vital role in understanding the impact of such events, as we do not only look at the impact on military infrastructure and military organizations and units, but it's our task to look how those events impact the civil actors in the civil environment. And that will have definitely a result on the capability of a civil environment to provide support to military activities. So it's a kind of circle. And we are pushing that constantly to have a permanent assessment cycle on what we do, what happens to us, how does that impact the civil environment and the impacted civil environment, how is that still able to provide the support to the military. And I think as we are in that position to have those connections to the other organizations and to provide a holistic assessment about the civil environment, that plays a vital role in that one. Absolutely.
So do you see that as the future of CIMIC from now going forward, is to build that more holistic partner nation?
I would like to use the definition of multi-domain operations as it is currently used in NATO, and that is the orchestration of all military activities to achieve converging effects. And I see the future role of CIMIC very much in that synchronization effort. So military capabilities are much, much less available than in the past. So when we think about what we need about capacities and resources to achieve our military strategic objectives, when we go into the details, 60, 70, partly 80% of what we need as resource is not generated within the military. It needs to be contracted and provided by a civil environment. And that means that there needs to be a constant assessment process about the availability of those 60, 70, 80% civil support. And it needs to be thoroughly assessed because that has a pushing out effect on the civil environment. When we use the trains for military equipment, then those trains cannot be used to support and supply the civil environment. So I think the future of CIMIC is in that synchronization bit with the non-military activities to reach those converging effects. And that pretty much fits into the whole of government, whole of society approach of defense.
Interesting. So CIMIC is in multi-domain operations, has its own multi-domain operation because it's coordinating the civil government NGOs, whoever is not formal military, in cooperation or in conjunction with the military's multi-domain operations. So you've got a multi-tiered coordination process.
I think we do not run our own multi-domain operations, a multi-tiered task. I think that captures it quite well. But I personally prefer to speak more about cooperation, because coordination is a very tricky expression, especially in Europe, as coordination requires someone who allows to be coordinated and someone who has a coordinating authority. And in the interaction with our civil partners, it's more cooperation, ranging from we do exist beside each other to full integrated planning and operations. There's a continuum of that, the area of cooperation. So I do really prefer to speak more about cooperation than coordination.
Is there any other topics or thoughts that you want to add to the conversation?
For me, it's really important to highlight the future concepts like multi-domain operations and to establish and maintain the connection with the current concepts. So it is important to keep the future world of NATO connected to the current operational world of NATO. That is exactly why we run the annual CIMIC Foresight Conference, is to connect the here and now with the time period of 1 to 2 years to the future concepts, 10, 20 years. And secondly, the closer connection and the better synchronization of the national efforts with the alliance efforts. That is really, I think, a key centerpiece of our future success. So in my understanding, it is ongoing. It is happening in the alliance as we speak right now. So alliance joint headquarters, strategic headquarters have established contact to national military authorities and do exchange information. But I think that needs to become more intensive, more regularly, and more information flow to both sides. And that needs to be not only foreseen conceptually and structurally, it needs to be trained and exercised regularly. And I think that's really a clear measurement of success if we are able to exercise it in the future massively. And thirdly, I think the aspect of human security and protection of civilians, that is something which creates a dilemma for every military leader, because he would like to achieve his military objectives. That is either to defeat the enemy or to force him to do something or to force him to stay away from something, which means the application of massive violence to the enemy. However, when we learn something from the recent international crisis or from the war in Ukraine, then what we have learned is the battlefield is full of civilians that have requirements, that have needs. The battlefield is full of organizations, non-governmental, governmental organizations that try to provide a certain amount of services to the civilians. And it doesn't matter if it is a war zone or the rear area or the area behind the rear area. We have to realize that it is and will remain full of civilians. To evacuate a city like Kiev is nonsense. That will never happen.
23 million people.
Yeah, good luck with that one. And even if you try, the majority of the capabilities will be provided by the civilian world. So human security, protection of civilians are concepts which are mandatory for NATO. NATO has adhered to it. We have adopted it in our strategies and our plans into our operations. But what does that really mean? How do we really translate protection of civilian and human security into operations on the operational and even on the tactical level? And I think that needs some assistance, how to operationalize it, how to conduct, how to do it. This assistance, in my understanding, is called mindset and CIMIC.
Terrific.
It's good to do CIMIC, but you have to talk about it. It's good to increase the awareness, but you have to publish it. So I am very grateful and very thankful to have the opportunity to talk with you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you coming on.
Thank you very much and have a good day.
Thanks for listening. If you get a chance, please like and subscribe and rate the show on your favorite podcast platform. Also, if you're interested in coming on the show or hosting an episode, email us at capodcasting@gmail.com. I'll have the email and CA Association website in the show notes. And now, most importantly, to those currently out in the field, working with a partner nation's people or leadership to forward U.S. relations, thank you all for what you're doing. This is Jack, your host. Stay tuned for more great episodes. One CA Podcast.